Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. We are going through Dante's Divine Comedy, and we have reached Purgatory, finally. So folks, the format is very simple. You get to talk about what you've gotten from the chapters. In order to offer what you have, in order to give your take on it, just go ahead and type exclamation mark in chat and we will go through everybody, okay? And once everybody has had a chance to put their thoughts about the chapters on the table, then we're going to do breakout rooms. We're going to break into groups of about 6 to 8 people and discuss it. And then we will come back to talk about the big questions that we still have left. We'll raise all the questions and do a lightning round of answers. That's the format. I'm honored to have Phil and Doug here, who have been with us throughout. So we're going to start with Doug. Anybody who wants to share their takeaways, and I encourage you to share the takeaways, because you get a lot more when you actually speak than just listen or just read. All right, so Doug, the floor is yours.
Okay, I accidentally double booked myself today to go to the Norton Simon Museum is reopening, an art museum for like churches to me. My brother dragged me through art museums as a kid. And I thought, oh, this is a terrible conflict. And then I realized it might actually work for my benefit because of the mixture of nature and art that exists here, which is a theme in Dante, and the color green. So I'm actually in the sculpture garden at the Norton Simon, which is a lily pond that's designed to impersonate Monet's lily pond. And so you can sort of see, and there's all this wonderful sculpture. And the color green, he keeps mentioning the green of new leaves. And I think this place, a guard just swept by me, but he wasn't after me. So, but I've always thought the greens here are really luminescent. And so I thought I'd share that. The other thing that struck me in the last week or two, I began to think that a lot of the Divine Comedy was reminding me of Fellini, because I think I've commented before that I try to follow the movement that I see in the language. You know, the people moving, sweeping to the shore to get on the boat to enter, to cross the river in the first canto, and then the way the people get off the boat at the beginning of Purgatory, and then they're really disoriented and they kind of sweep on Dante and Virgil. They kind of really just, and he describes them as not knowing where they are, that they're really confused, that they're, and they come to Virgil and Dante assuming they know where they are, and they don't know much more than the people who sweep off the boat. But the way the crowd sweeps at them and then other crowds sweep at them, it reminds me of all the paparazzi sweeping at various people in Fellini films, the movement of crowds and pilgrims. And I began to think, well, pilgrims, yeah, a lot of Fellini's films are about pilgrimages. And Scorsese has a film called My Journey to Italy, or My Travels to Italy, which is describing his experience of watching Italian films when he was growing up in Little Italy in New York. And then he travels back to Italy and he talks about all these films. So Scorsese did a pilgrimage to Italy to track Italian filmmakers. And I kept thinking, oh, Dante is really influenced by, Fellini is really influenced by Dante. And then I actually found a resource finally about a week or two later after I had this idea called Fellini, Cinema, and Television. And apparently the first movie that Fellini saw as a child was an adaptation of the Inferno. And then that's not talked about a lot, but there is this one book. It's about $80. I can't afford it, but it's on JSTOR, I think, if you can get access to JSTOR. And it's a wonderful study by different authors of Dante's influence on movies and on TV. And so the pilgrimage really stuck with me. So let me see if I can flip the camera again. And when I was writing the Bucky play, I was doing long walks, reading tons of Bucky material, doing long walks through San Diego, and then coming back a long distance and seeing the same landscape from a different perspective. And so I realized the pilgrim is always in a strange land. And then when he circles back, it all looks very different, maybe because of the experience he had. So here there's a path. You can only walk sort of one direction here because of the COVID controls. So they're controlling the pilgrimages through the sculpture garden. You might be able to see some people moving through. You know, this walk through a landscape or through a collection of artwork. And in Dante's film, and in Fellini's films, there are all these pilgrims. But it also shows up in Hollywood films in a way with the pioneer tradition. And you don't see the word pilgrim used much except by John Wayne. And so then I got a very facetious idea that you could cast, you know, Virgil and Dante the way The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance was cast. You know, John Wayne is the good guide and James Stewart is the innocent who doesn't like people fighting, although I think he's the one who finally kills Liberty Valance, and Lee Marvin plays the evil character. So those are kind of the riffs. But the way birds move, the way different people move, the way there are gardens and the way there are a journey often to, well, like an 8.5, it starts with Guido crawling out of the window of a car and then floating over the cars and then up into the sky. And then he falls from the sky. So I'm just sitting here and realizing there are all these pilgrims passing me by. I can't do what I wanted to do because suddenly I'm surrounded by a ton of people. But those were some of my main hits. The other was the idea that the journey, the way Dante talks about it, the more you get to the top, the more you get to, the closer you get to the top, the easier it gets, to where he describes it's like floating, like there's a path there. It's like the more you get to the top, it's almost like floating downstream. It gets very easy. And so I'm beginning to realize I used to take long hikes as a Boy Scout and then camping alone. My parents used to take me and a friend to the source of a canyon and they'd let us go. I mean, we were 14, 15. They'd drop us off at this canyon. We'd hike in, fish, camp for 2 or 3 days. And then the other parents, the parents of my friend, would come and pick us up at the opening of what was called the Siskiyou Creek Reservoir, which was actually a condor reserve. So you'll see here, you know, if I walk this direction, that's a pilgrimage is out and then it's back. So if I walk this direction, you're seeing kind of one thing. And there's a Henry Moore statue over here. So suddenly there's something to look at. But if I turn around and go this way, it's a very different path. And suddenly you see these paths diverging that weren't clear when I walked out the other direction. And then it's a very different landscape. I just walked the same 15 feet, but it looks completely different when you go out or when you go in. So there are other thoughts I had. I don't know that I want to share them now. Hopefully I can get back to you when it's a little less noise around me for maybe the last half hour of the meeting. But are there any?
Sounds good. So Doug, thank you. So whenever you're ready, just go ahead and you can message me or put an exclamation mark and I will call on you, okay?
Okay, when I get back into the meeting, you mean?
Got it. Yes. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay.
Have to leave soon, unless
All
there are
right.
any.
Next up is going to be Joe. Joe, go ahead.
It's hard to follow that. I mean, I'm not in a park, so I mean, that it makes it a little bit challenging. But I actually didn't prepare anything, but I will share some things that had stuck out to me in reading it this time around. Is that I was really actually shocked that Cato was the first person that was that they saw, because primarily Cato's, and I just know a little bit about Cato in general. He committed suicide. So I thought to myself, what is he doing here? So that was the first thing that was kind of shocking to me. But the other thing that I really was kind of surprised about is just how well everybody gets along in purgatory versus what hell is. Hell is something that you really felt the difference between the individuals that he engaged with, that Dante and Virgil engaged with, all throughout purgatory. I mean, Cato comes off as a little bit of an older, curmudgeon, but everybody they engage with along the way seems to be jovial, or thinking for they have something to look forward to. There's also an element of, I guess there's a limit to the knowledge that Virgil has at this particular moment in time, and the knowledge that Dante has as well, as to what is possible moving forward. So what they're going to encounter. There's a lot of intrigue there. And I think that speaks to the limits of knowledge in general. I also started to feel a little bit, I don't know what the word is, maybe badly for Virgil in this whole process as he was going through it. Because I thought to myself, it really doesn't seem fair that he's stuck in limbo. I'm looking through my notes really quickly here, and I may come back and even have additional comments. That the one thing that another thing that was struck me is that they were praying the Our Father as well. I think that's in Canto 10, I believe. I have to look at my notes. It might be actually, I think I have it right in front of me. It is Canto 11. So because the idea that Our Father is a prayer of to not lead them into temptation, but they're in purgatory. So I really didn't understand that aspect of it too. But there's also this connection that between earth, between the living and the souls in purgatory. And again, it's not clear to me that if what prayers do for the souls in purgatory either, whether they can alter the will of heaven. And I think that's going to get answered maybe down the line. But I can come back in a minute, like as soon as I gather my thoughts. I have a lot of other notes here that I just need to figure out. Thanks.
Sounds good. Thanks. Thanks, Joe. Phil, I forgot to ask you, do you have any preference whether you want to go early or later, or what do you think?
Up to you. I can either way.
Very good. Okay.
Yeah, if you want to keep going with
sure.
Fine.
Sounds good. Madeline, you're next.
Yes, I'm not sure how well my audio was working today.
It's good.
Okay, thanks. There were a couple of things. One is, although Doug has left the meeting temporarily, I loved it that he was actually enacting a physical journey and walk while talking about the physical journey and walk. It was very nicely, a nice meta event. And for me, I think the biggest revelation, having come from a somewhat not very especially Christian background, was simply learning about what purgatory is. The introduction in my book discussed it as if you had been stabbed by a knife and it has been withdrawn, and Purgatory is the time when the wound is healing. So that was incredibly helpful to me. And I also loved the part where Dante discusses that from here on, the journey gets easier. In other words, although you're still moving forward, every part of it gets easier and easier. It's no longer such a big effort. And I was also struck by, with the healing aspect of it, I was thinking about how it reminded me of karma in a way, in that you are reliant upon the goodwill that has been generated in your lifetime to move you forward in this hierarchical system. So whether it's karma in Buddhism that's going to move you forward through the goodwill, the good deeds you've done in your lifetime, or whether it's the prayers of people who remember you in this Christian system that are going to move you forward in the afterlife. So those were my basic thoughts. I'm not as well as prepared as Joe is.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Maxine, followed by David S. Maxine.
There were a lot of things that were interesting to me. And one of the things, he predicts the future. He saw people flying at that time. Can you, unless he was thinking of Icarus, because he had a great vision that we're going to fly, and we are. And this particular Purgatory, well, it got more palatable because he brought in art, and he brought in sculpture, and he brought in the Capulets and the Montagues, not actually, but a representation of that. And he brought a lot of artistic things in there, that instead of all the religious things that he could have, well, he could have bored us to death with the religion, but he broke it up with all the culture. So that, for me, was more palatable.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Maxine. And I'm glad that you and your guide, Joe, made it to Purgatory. I know you claim that you are the guide and Joe is Dante, but I don't know which one is which, but I'm glad that both of you together as a team made it. Okay, so that was pretty impressive.
I feel like we're both in Purgatory.
Okay, next up is going to be David, Zach, and Franklin. David.
Yeah, it's so different reading this. You know, it's such a relief compared to what we were doing before. I don't know if this was said. I'm sorry, I was a bit late. So the kinds of gifts you get in this process, as opposed to in the Inferno, where there's regret for everything, and you're like reflecting, but there's without hope. It's being held down in a way that you'll always be held down. And then this is saying, oh, wait, there's some ways you can look at other stuff, because in our lives we're always looking at, oh, I did this wrong. Can it ever, can it ever heal? And you were talking about healing. Someone was just talking about healing. So we're already progressing to better things. Previously, we were progressing was to worse and worse things. You didn't know how bad it was going to get. And now we're going to things that are more subtle, but it's not with that descending sort of, yes, it's going to be worse every time than we thought, but it's still going up. So I like that. And the second thing is reflection on the time it takes to heal and the process it takes to heal, and walking through it and really reviewing all the subtleties is going to be fantastic, because we looked at many dimensions of real guilt that can't be undone if it's not dealt with. And now we're dealing with, how do you deal with it? What do you process it? Reviewing and regretting, but not in that hopeless way. So this is this is a different kind of lesson to take through with Dante. Okay, we're living, we're still breathing, We're the only ones in our lives that are really living in this story. So what is it like for the inhabitants as we go through these levels? What is it like we're living with them momentarily? And what is that paralleling in us as we prepare ourselves?
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, David. Next up is Zach. Zach, go ahead.
Yeah, so I haven't finished the entire reading. I'm about halfway through this section, but one thing that really stood out to me just about purgatory in general was learning that it was up to the sinners in purgatory to kind of decide when they are ready to move on to paradise. And just how kind of different of a conception that is than Inferno, where it's, you know, God or the creator who is making the judgment and saying, okay, God's the one condemning people. Whereas this is kind of saying it's up to you to decide when you're ready to progress to paradise. So that kind of shocked me that God or the creator or whoever was willing to kind of put that judgment in the people's hands to decide for themselves when they're ready to advance into paradise. So I would love to hear kind of more about that, if that was just Dante's own unique thought, or if that was a common thought amongst Christians, or if it still is a common thought amongst Christians. But yeah, anybody who's kind of more of a scholar in Christianity, I'd love to hear more about that idea.
Excellent. Zach, if we don't get to it, in the Q&A, please raise this question. Thank you. Next up is Franklin and Allison. Franklin.
Yeah, I was just delighted and impressed that we're...
Can you speak more into the mic?
Yeah, let me clear this off. I was amazed by the synthesis of a mythological image, which would be a very familiar image. Like this was what the Bible considered to be real, but it's not the physical world. It's the mythical image of the human with the imagination and the emotions and the spirit that's trying to make its way back to God. But then he peppers it with history and with all these characters that are actual historical figures. So you've got historical figures interacting in this labyrinth of the astral world, and it's fascinating. And I was struck by the moment when he encounters, forget his name, but they're begging them to remind their ancestors to pray for them, because if we're not remembered, then we will disappear. But if we're remembered, then we can keep going.
Wonderful. Thank you, Franklin. Next up is going to be Alison. Alison.
So one thing I've been really noticing is the parallel to how purgatory feels and how the mood in America feels right now as we're coming out of the pandemic. That there's a lightness and a joy, but we're not quite to heaven yet, but we're on our way. And then something else I kept thinking about was, why did he choose to make it on an island and with a mountain on it? And then I came across this one line in the first canto where he says, he goes in search of freedom and how dear that is. The man who gives up life for it is well knows. And then I was thinking that I feel like this book is really just a metaphor for any journey from darkness to light, or pain to joy. And then it can apply. I think it's why we still read it 700 years later, because it's not just about hell and heaven. I mean, whether somebody is fleeing a war, fleeing a pandemic, searching for freedom in any way at all, essentially it's kind of like you're on an island, because as much as people want to help you, you have to do the work yourself, and it is work to attain joy. And you have to climb a mountain, and you have to do the hard work of it. Almost nobody wins the lottery, but many people, move to another country. They move somewhere that's safer. They leave a war. So it really could be applied to so many things. So
wonderful. Thank you, Alison. Next up is going to be Phil. Folks, if anybody else wants to share, what they got from these cantos, please go ahead and type exclamation mark in chat or raise your hand in Zoom. Phil.
Okay. Could you make me a host or allow me to share screen?
You are already a host and you can share.
Oh, okay, perfect. Okay. So I wanted to just sort of formalize. A lot of people have mentioned some of the similarities between.
Phil, I love your spreadsheets, by the way.
Thank you. Well, I'm a very analytical type of person, and so I like lists.
Dante would have approved.
I guess so. I mean, maybe Doug and I were sort of good together because we balance each other out. Doug is very artistic, and I'm more engineering type, which you need both to make a good sort of complete presentation. Anyway, so as I think actually CJ sent out an email to this effect as well with listing some of the things, and I wanted to kind of come up with a list of my own just to formalize it and put it out there. And again, this is food for thought. It's not a completeness list necessarily, but just something to think about very quickly about the obvious differences that exist between the two cantos that we've read so far, or are reading so far. So the obvious one, of course, is, we've already noticed this idea of geography and the fact that Dante uses geographical metaphors for describing the mood and the content of what he is portraying. And so obviously in Inferno, we're going down, and purely, again, geographically in Purgatory, we're going up. And that has some connotations around just the mood and the dynamics of the journey. If you remember, we were constantly turning to the left as we were descending in Inferno. The Latin word for left is sinister, from where we get, sinister and evil and all the rest of it. And I was thinking, actually, different languages, the word for right and righteousness in English, it's not just a coincidence that you have these synonyms of the direction right, and then these terms that have nothing to do with direction. Well, on the face of it, upright, righteousness, doing the right thing. Why does that, like, what's the connection there? And then I couldn't help thinking that in different languages, I think these concepts actually these derivations exist in other languages as well. So I know, like Russian, completely different word for right, but they have the same concept, right and righteousness and upright. They're all grouped together, possibly because maybe the right hand was the normative hand for doing work, and then anything done with the right hand was therefore assumed to be correct, proper, etc. So anyway, but Dante makes a point of saying that they're turning to the right as they're going up the mount. And of course, in Inferno, as we're descending, we're constantly turning to the left. In other words, getting more and more into the evil part of hell. Several people have noted that there's a increasing harshness in hell as you go down, and also decreasing difficulty as you go up the mount. And I think that also makes some sense, also in the way that the defects that are purged are ordered in a way of being less and less punishment worthy. So we start with pride, which is the harshest sin that you can imagine in a Christian sort of worldview. And of course, that's where we ended up in hell with Lucifer, who is the epitome of pride. More on that a little bit below. And then, just think also this idea of time and progression. Time is kind of frozen in hell in some way, not completely, because there's still final judgment, but time is, you're frozen. There is no progress. It's only regress. It's only getting worse, or you're stuck in whatever worst state you possibly can be. And it's the opposite in Purgatory, where there's movement, but it's not a movement in a circle. Like, remember in Inferno, there were people that were just constantly going back and forth, but there's no progress. Their movement is completely cyclical. They're not advancing. But in Purgatory, it's the opposite. You're constantly advancing, even if you're just waiting in the anti-Purgatory. So there's a big difference there in the conception of time. Also, this the role of nature is markedly different. Again, several people noted how Doug was able to present this at this point by walking in the park. That was great. And the color green, I agree. It's definitely the color of rebirth, of growth, and even the wonderful metaphor of us being a caterpillar of the angelic butterfly is I think fitting to be mentioned in this context. So there's definitely that aspect of it, the presence of nature and its role in purgatory is definitely dominant versus hell, where it's either absent or it's distorted, contorted, like the wood of the suicides, where you have the stumps of trees and everything is sort of deformed. The stars are constellations are dominant in purgatory, both as markers, but also as again, as maybe something that to aspire to, right? We reach towards the stars. I think I mentioned before, there's a derivation of the word desire from the Latin word for stars. So that concept, I think, is present also in purgatory, where the people that inhabit purgatory are reaching for something new. They're aspiring, literally, to go up. There's a marked difference in the presence of music and singing and hymns. And I put together a, let me just do this listing of the different hymns. One second. Let's see. Can you see this? The hymns. Can everybody see this?
Yes.
Okay, so we have several hymns and they're almost like sandwiching the cantos. So in the very first canto you have a preliminary introduction and a link that links us back to Inferno. But then right away in the second canto, we have a hymn that is sung by those people that arrive just cross the chasm of death and they're coming to purgatory. And then you have the Miserere, and some of these hymns are very famous, especially the Te Deum Laudamus, which is, I think, the oldest Christian hymn that we have that is preserved, the lyrics and possibly even the tonality. Most of these are Gregorian chants, so they were chanted. And if you're interested, there we have recordings of all of these hymns. So if anyone is interested, I can put a link there too, so you can listen to some of these. So these are excellent and interesting examples of the Christian liturgy and the music that I guess Dante was thinking of as he is writing the Purgatory. Let me go back to this for a second. And then you have also this emphasis on art, which was not really present in Inferno, except for in the negative sense, where we dealt with fraud, which is the opposite of art. So fraud and art are the two polar concepts that Dante explores. Inferno is all about the distortion of art, things like counterfeiting and all different ways to earn a living that bypass what he considers a natural inclination of a human is to be artful. And then in Purgatory, there's this the opposite, this idea of art as being crucial. This last thing I just wanted to point out, the idea of Purgatory, of course, is that we're getting purged from different sins. The list of sins actually is something known as the 7 deadly sins, starting with pride. And right here in this column, and I will share this file afterwards. You had this list in Latin of all the sins. Right now we're just exploring the first one, superbia, which is pride. But then all of them are listed, and this list was pretty consistent in medieval times. Everybody knew it. It's not actually a list that appears in the Bible, surprisingly. It's kind of a made-up list, but it was so popular that it became canonical. And so Dante arranges his terraces based on this list, which is not a scriptural again, but something that was just very popularly shared and understood. And if you notice, it's the order is reversed from hell to Inferno. So in hell, we first see the lightest sin, lust, which is luxuria, but this is the last one, last of the terraces actually in Purgatory, and vice versa. In the last circle, circle 9, we have Lucifer, who is obviously represents pride and fall from God, and this is where we start in Purgatory. So you start with the harshest, the most damaging sins, and as you progress, you go to the lightest. So it's interesting again to note that in Dante's mind, lust, fornication, gluttony, those are really the lightest defects of a human psyche versus what he considers to be the most damaging, which is this prideful attitude. Yeah, that's what I wanted to share. Let me start the sharing part. I have some other thoughts, but maybe after the break rooms, I just wanted to kind of give an overview of the big picture.
Perfect. Does anybody else want to share their takeaways before the breakout rooms? If you'd like to share what you got, you can go ahead and type exclamation mark. All right, so I'll wait for 10 seconds and then I'm going to start the breakout rooms. Folks in the breakout rooms, please give a chance for everybody to talk for 1 to 2 minutes on what they got.
Is there a question? Is there a question you want to pose for the breakout?
No, the questions are simply, what is it that you got? Any impressions? So everybody talks about what they got from it. And then it's going to be a short breakout rooms, 20 minutes. And then we'll come back and there everybody picks the question that they want to put on the table. So that's the plan. All right, folks, so I'm starting the breakout rooms now. We'll be back again in 20 minutes. And Phil, what will happen is that people may not have chance to download the spreadsheet, so please put that in the chat again after we come back. All right, starting the breakout rooms now. Welcome back, folks. Welcome back. So it's time for questions. So it's time for questions. Go ahead and type exclamation mark. What we're going to do is we're going to collect all the questions, and then we're going to do a lightning round of answers. Go ahead and type exclamation mark if you have questions. Zach, you had a question.
Yeah, my question was, if anybody could elaborate on the point about how the condemned, or I guess not condemned because they're not in Inferno, but how the souls in Purgatory got to decide for themselves when they were ready for Paradise. If anybody could elaborate on that.
Excellent. How souls got to choose when they are ready to go to the next level. All right, anybody else? Go ahead and type exclamation mark if you'd like to put down a question. I mean, one general question is the difference between, what difference do you feel between Inferno and in Purgatory? What does it feel like to you? Inferno and Purgatory. Franklin.
Yeah, we were having a discussion, and maybe somebody can help answer the question as to whether there's, if it's well known or if there's evidence that Dante was familiar with alchemy, and is there, alchemical references in there?
Excellent. Was Dante familiar with alchemy and alchemic references here? Okay. Next up is Joe.
I have a few questions, but is there any, I guess, it's maybe somebody might have an answer to understanding how why there were so many excommunicated people in Purgatory. which is interesting because it's almost abandoning of his own faith to a certain degree.
Okay. Excommunicated. Okay. Very good. So let's start off. If you guys come, or if you think of any other questions, just go ahead and type in the question in the chat. All right. So first question is Zach's question. What is the basis of the souls themselves being able to choose when they leave purgatory? Anybody who wants to answer it can go ahead and raise your hand in Zoom or type exclamation mark. David.
Yeah, I sure don't know the guaranteed religious answer, but I have a feel it makes sense to me, because these are souls that are just about saved. They're going to be in union with God. They're not corrupt in that way that's unredeemable. So they're not looking for an inappropriate way out. They're in a process that makes sense in the universal order, and they're part of it in a positive way. And when they get rid of that guilt, they're in a good place. So it makes sense that they're self-judging, but there are restrictions. We know there are restrictions. They're subject to 30 times your life for this. So it's kind of a good combination. There's a free will aspect to it, but within constraint.
Excellent. Anybody else? Madeline.
Yes, one of the things we talked about in my breakout room was the differences between the Inferno and the Purgatory.
Mm-hmm.
And the main difference was, differences were in Purgatory, there was hope. There was a future. In hell, there were no children. There was no art. There were no stars. There was no greenery. Whereas in Purgatory, there's a sense of a future, that time is passing, that things are progressing, and people aren't just repeating the same things over and over and over again. And that the stars and the greenery and the nature were a very important part of that.
Wonderful. So we'll do that question. What differences do you see between Inferno and Purgatory? What struck to you? Anybody? David, go ahead. I thought David had unmuted, but go ahead. Joe, go ahead.
Yeah, I can go ahead. I think that there are some amazing, some of the big differences were music and, the stars, the sun, off to the art, the artwork when they go through the gate that they see. These are things that you have a sense of hopelessness in hell. Whereas when you're some of these things that we take for granted, like art, like music, they're so evident, and it really just jumps out at you that I see that as the big difference. The other part is the way, again, that the people are interacting with each other in hell.
Mm-hmm.
They're in hell, they're chewing each other's heads. I mean, and everything is ice. There's all kinds of feelings of pain and suffering. The pain and suffering here seems to have a point. There's a destination that we're moving towards, which is completely different than hell as well. And overall, it felt like a relief, a complete relief. But I guess the arts, it really does call the importance to the arts in general. And I really felt like the analogy I used in our breakout room was, it's almost like prison hell.
Mm-hmm.
And where there's no future, there's no children, there's no art, there's art, but it may not be art that you're that you would necessarily be new or exposed to for the first time. Whereas, Purgatory, there just seems to be these things that we take for granted. The stars, again, the sun, things like that. Anyway, that wasn't really terribly coherent, but.
Thank you. Thank you, Joe. Next up is going to be Franklin, Madeline, and David. Franklin.
Yeah, to go back to alchemy, I think we can find a useful analogy there. This being psychological, it's archetypal, it is the human condition. And in alchemy, we begin with negredo, the blackening, where we turn our attention back and take a look at the faults that have been ruining our lives, right? We're no longer thinking it's out there. We turn around and say, wait a minute, the problem is here. Pay attention to what I'm doing. And this is a very depressing, darkening, because you're looking at the real problems of yourself. Then we get to albedo, which is called the whitening. And this is where we give up the vices and we start to correct the habits that are creating the mess. And this is a difficult stage, a tentative stage. There's a problem of what Hellman called alchemical white, where we project out there and think, I'm pure, I'm going to get on my horse and slay the monster, rather than hold a mirror to find out that, hey, that monster's me. So anyway, that seems right. And then the final stage would be rubedo, the reddening, and that would be like the rose of the heart when we get to that radiant center. So alchemy.
Wonderful. Thank you. Next up is going to be Madeline, followed by David. Madeline.
Yeah, I was in the same breakout room as Joe, and it was the prison metaphor was a very powerful one. It worked extremely well. I was thinking that another difference, or actually it was a similarity between the two, was that in hell, as everyone was repeating the same things over and over again, Dante actually did the same thing. As he observed each group or each person who was doing something, he would do the same thing. He would betray the traitors. He stroked the thighs of the gay men. He participated in some way in every single one of those things. So he was, and I think it was a way of showing that even the most innocent among us contains all of that within us. And one thing I noticed, at least so far in the Purgatorio, is that when he was with the lazy people, he got so absorbed in what was happening that suddenly the whole day was over. Like it had just gone by and he wasn't even sure what had happened. So that was another way of participating, I think.
Thank you. Next up is going to be David Johnson and then David Sturman. David Johnson.
Oh, hello there. I am currently reading Virgil's Aeneid. So I am getting it from both sides. And well, my question was about the efficiency of prayer and how Virgil is wrote against it, the effectiveness of prayer to the gods, or in Dante's case, one god, and the conflict between Dante and Virgil in Canto 6.
Okay, so that's the question. So I'll put that question at the end. We'll come to that. David, the other David.
Right. Hey, I want to join in the chorus of my group that met, because we talked about a couple of things together and agreed a lot on the openness when you come out of Inferno, the contrast of being in the open and with the sky above and climbing up. And you're climbing up towards the sun, and we know what the sun is. It's the source of love and warmth. And so it's just a different kind of breathing and hope, especially after she's washed everything off. So so having the stars keeps reminding you of that even at night. And also what Madeline said about Dante, every sin you see, you recap. What was that? What did that, and ooh, does that reflect on me? And Dante, with his pride that he's always talked about, what a great poet he is. And here he is standing in Pride Land, looking at these people crushed under these stones, crawling under them and contemplating and talking about reacting to feeling where they are. So, and as was said in our group, so that makes us think about him and feel where he is, and then we feel where they are. So it really conveys you, it pulls you in. And I think the thing about Virgil is he's a little off base here. He's in rationality land, and I think the power of this area is beyond him.
Wonderful, thank you. Next up is Judy. Judy, go ahead.
Okay, I have a question. It's really a more of a personal comment. I took a lot of catechism and learned a lot about that dogma in Catholicism, and they kept talking about venial sins and original sin. And the ones who had venial sins or died before baptism, for example, went to purgatory. They kept saying that. And the ones who had mortal sins, and that's why you had to go to confession and only confess the mortal sins. So that if you died, you would go to purgatory. So I don't know, is there like a connection there with the venial sins and the mortal sins and the original sins and all these other sins that dogma teaches? And was Dante influenced by all that? I'm not sure whether he studied Catholic dogma at that time.
Sure.
Yeah.
Excellent question. So we'll put that at the end. Very good. Next, let's see. Okay, the next question. So we got 4 more questions. The question, Tim, you have unmuted. You have something to talk about?
No, I'm okay. Thank
you. All right. Let's go to the next question. The next question is on alchemy. Did Dante know about alchemy, and what evidence do you see of alchemy in this work? Anybody? Franklin.
Well, just as an archetypal progression from a state of confusion and heading into a mess, descending into hell, and then going through a purification, and then arriving at oneness with the divine. This is the alchemical process, and this is psychology on an archetypal level.
Thank you. Next up is Michael. Michael, go ahead. Michael, you need to unmute yourself.
There we go. Okay. Looking through the poem, I don't see any reference thus far to alchemy other than in the Inferno, where the alchemists, I believe, are in the 8th circle, and it seems that, well, what's been said about alchemy certainly has some psychological parallels, but I'm not sure that makes sense to apply to Dante's approach to it. And I think that for him, Dante, it was a fraudulent activity.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you. Next question is going to be on excommunication. Why are so many people who are excommunicated in purgatory? Anybody?
Oh, damn it. This is too tough.
Madeline.
Yeah, I was just wondering if anyone here could clarify exactly what excommunication means.
Okay, anybody who knows about this can go ahead and just, Franklin, go ahead.
Yeah, my grandfather was excommunicated and had to go to Rome to get reinstated, and you could not trade, you could not, and your neighbors couldn't communicate with you anymore. You were no longer part of the body of the culture. You're in another body and you're incommunicado. You don't exist, basically. And that was because he built a church where the Rome hadn't said, yeah, you can build a church there, but they had to travel like 20 miles to church, in like blizzards and things. So they built their own church, and then had to go to Rome to say, listen, we weren't trying to break the law. We're just trying to save our lives.
Wonderful.
Isn't Luther the most significant excommunicant?
Right.
Oh, yeah, but
So what he did, he earned his excommunication, apparently.
Excommunication is you're effectively banned and wiped out from the Catholic Church. So if you're excommunicated, that means that all of the rites that you've done, baptism, communion, etc., also never took place. So you are now back in the state of original sin, which is likely in Catholicism, they will say you're going to hell. Dante puts him in purgatory.
Thank you. Next up is Michael.
yeah, I think that the distinction there is those who have been excommunicated or cut off from the sacraments of the church. It is a church administrative act, and it is done on the strength of the biblical charge to Peter that what you loose in heaven shall, or loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven, and so on. But that there were rules that said you couldn't really, if I'm excommunicated and subsequently I repent of whatever it was, and the excommunication has not been lifted, then what happens is that there's a period, it all gets, church legal stuff. There's a period of so many years or decades or 30 times the number of whatever, during which I have to either wait to get into purgatory, even to get into it, and then once I'm into it, I have a further penalty to pay, and it recognized the fallibility of the church, of the bishops, smartly, and so it's a fairly complex area. But in Dante's time, there would have been a lot of people that would have been excommunicated just with a wave of the hand. If a city had opposed Pope's forces trying to take them over, he would routinely excommunicate the whole town. And so there's a lot of that goes on. So it's not surprising that there are lots of excommunicants around. But they also had to have repented.
Thank you. Next up is Judy, followed by Mike. Judy.
Yeah, this excommunication thing, I just want to say a little bit about it. My mother was excommunicated from the church when she got her divorce, but we lived in a very small town. And what that meant was that she could not receive communion in front of everybody in the social environment of the church. But she later moved to San Francisco, which is a big town and a liberal town, as everybody knows. And when she went to talk to the priest, he said, "Oh yeah, you can go to communion. Nobody knows anything here." So I think it's more of a social thing and making you feel shamed in front of the people that know you than anything else. I think that's what excommunication is all about.
Thank you. But I think Franklin's point is excellent. Like, the mobility of people to move to San Francisco did not exist in Dante's time.
No.
People were kind of stuck in the place that they were.
Yeah.
There was hardly any mobility. And given that, being cut off from the society that you are in was a very, very serious thing.
Yeah.
Thank you. Next up is Mike.
Regarding alchemy, Capaccio got into his problem for dealing with alchemy as a violation of God's laws. And Galileo, much later, was accused, got excommunicated, or was almost put to death because of his astronomy was interpreted as both alchemy and astrology, which was also against the church. So
thank you. Thank you, Mike. Next up is Madeline.
Yes, just in response to what Mike was saying about Galileo, the problem The church didn't, actually, they didn't have really have a problem with the science. What they were upset about was that he was saying it was fact. What they wanted him to say was that it was more like a theory or a speculation, and he wouldn't do that. And apparently the problem, anyway, so that was the basis of the problem, and that's what he went to ground for. The Jesuits were very sophisticated. They followed his reasoning. The people in the higher parts of the church could understand what he was talking about, and they agreed with it, but they didn't want it presented as fact. They wanted it presented as theory.
Okay, thank you. Next up, we're going to take the question about the power of prayer. David, do you want to restate your question?
Yes, in Canto 6, there's a differing, there's a conflict between Dante and Virgil over whether prayers to the gods or the God are effective and can alter circumstance. And of course, in the Roman world, Greek world, the answer was no, because it was all the gods weren't even in control. It was the fates that had it. But the Christian ideal is different. So that's what I wanted to see. What was the resolution?
So, all right. So answers to this question, Joe.
So I think there's a resolution coming. I don't know. I have to keep reading when he gets to Beatrice. But I have to just bring this up, and it's a slightly off topic, but it was directly related to what we discussed Friday night, and something with the idea of prayer, and how it's perceived, like the prayer to get somebody out of purgatory. This is like you're asking God for something. Is very different than the prayer we analyzed Friday night, which was more about that your inner peace that you're looking to achieve. And this is something significant for the church, because you're actually praying for something, you're asking for something constantly. And that's a different relationship with God than, say, seeing a more internal relationship where you're seeking peace, which is the point of Friday nights. But that was just an interesting distinction that I had noted. But I didn't get any resolution as to, I didn't see any resolution.
Okay.
So.
Anybody else wants to weigh in on this? Okay. Next.
Shrikant?
Yes, go ahead, Tim.
One thing I just want to point out in Catholicism, and this is Dante was Catholic. There's a whole structure of praying for things. There are saints that are, Saint Elmo is the saint of sailors. Saint Christopher used to be the patron saint of travelers, etc. And there's a hierarchy, much like the Roman structure, where you have lower saints, upper saints, God at the top. And you are actually encouraged to pray for things in Catholicism. You pray to Saint Christopher, you pray to Saint Elmo for your specific entreaty, and praying for the dead is also part of that. So I just want to bring that up.
Excellent. Thank you, Tim. The last question, and then we're going to go to Phil for his remaining comments. The question is, what are the different kinds of sin recognized in the Divine Comedy? Is there a distinction between mortal sins and other sins, original sins? Go ahead and type by exclamation mark if you would like to say something about this. Sure.
Yeah, I mean,
no, go ahead.
Is there somebody before me?
No. Go
ahead. Yeah, no, so mortal sins are grave. They require full consent, and and your deliberate intent. So it's a little bit slightly different, where venial sin is something that is much, it's much less serious. So there's really nobody in hell for venial sins when it comes to the Inferno. But yeah, that's the only distinction that I would make between those two.
Okay, Phil, any general comments you would like to make?
Yes, I want to mention a couple of topics. So one thing that, there's so many interesting details. So I guess you can take the track of either going to all these different things, which I think hopefully all of us are doing. But then there are some overarching themes that tend to emerge after you maybe read it over a couple of times, or you come back to this text over and over again. And for me, one of these overarching themes that run through the entire work is this tension between human artistic tendencies, if you will, and even maybe larger human relations, and this ideal, whether it's divine, whether it's somewhat idealistic, something, in other words, the real life, how it hits you there, including for Dante, who is an artist, the most important part of life as it hits him is his artistic ability, his talents, versus this ideal that he wants to describe in Purgatory and in Inferno and in Paradiso. And we see this tension throughout the work. And what I want to point out is several places where it kind of crops up and you can sort of trace it. So in Canto 2, if you remember, he sees his friend Casello, who starts playing the song which Dante himself requests for him to play. And it turns out, and if you've never read this before, if you're going along with this, you think, wow, that's great. That's just wonderful. They're reminiscing, they're enjoying this art. And then Cato comes to them and says, what are you guys doing? You are focusing on the past. You're focusing on this human relationship that you've had, human enjoyment, and you need to be, this is distracting you from a higher purpose. Now, this is Dante's intent, right? He's moralizing, he's making an ethical point there. Whether or not we as readers are convinced by that is a different story. And whether Dante himself was convinced by it, it's an open-ended question that we might want to ponder. Then again, in Canto 6, we have this character, Sordello. Sordello is a troubadour, is an iconic troubadour. It's actually very surprising he is in Purgatory at all. This guy was a notorious womanizer, but he also was an incredibly talented person. So Dante puts him in actually anti-purgatory. He's waiting a certain amount of time because he didn't repent until later in life, according to Dante. But historically, we don't have any record of him repenting at all. He was jumping from one woman, seducing one woman to the next, and it's just incredibly interesting that he's actually in Purgatory at all. Why does Dante put him in Purgatory? Is it because he feels a certain debt to the Provençal literature and everything that's associated with poetry? Because Sordello, we do have a lot of his poetry. It's quite interesting, and that's another one of those tensions that comes up. And unless you're paying attention, maybe you will not notice. But I want to bring it out so you can maybe think about it too. And then we have this amazing Canto 10, where Dante sees these marble carved out scenes, which are, he says explicitly that nature and Polycletus, who is the epitome of classical sculpting, have never approached this. So he brings up this ideal. And in this idealized art, you have this amazing thing where art tells a story. And it's almost speaking, and he says there's a conflict of senses, because you can almost hear something and yet you can't, because it's just stone, or you can almost smell something but you can't, because it's just marble. And so you see this amazing tribute that he pays to art. He almost venerates it as something divine, that's something that is transcendent. And yet in the very next canto, he's struggling again. He's struggling with this idea that as an artist, should you really be valuing your talent so much, because it's transitory. It's just going to go away. Your fame is going to go away. And he brings up several examples of this with Cimabue and Giotto, and then again with Guinizello and his friend Cavalcanti, who the two poets. One of them was famous originally, and then the other one essentially took over in becoming the spotlight, in taking the spotlight from the previous one. So all of these questions about art and our humanity, and versus the demands of this divine idealism are constantly being brought up. And I don't think they're resolved. I think they're meant for us to struggle with them, and I think Dante himself was struggling with them, even though he portrays it as a sort of answered question. I don't think he actually believed that completely. So I want to just point out this tension that really never goes away, even in Paradiso, but certainly not in Purgatory. There's definitely this tension between the human and divine, the relationships that we have with one another as people versus the sort of idealistic world that we're supposed to adhere to. In connection, okay, so that's one thing I wanted to point out. Very quickly, I want to point out another thing, and that is the story of Buonconte de Montefeltro in Canto 5. And if you guys remember this is the guy who gets converted on his deathbed. This is the classical deathbed conversion. So he is being stabbed, and as the knife is cutting the throat, he whispers Mary, and the angel comes and saves him. And then there's a demon that says, the devil that tries to reach out and say, wait, you're saving him because of one tear, that he's, one repentant tear, essentially. And this reminded me of Dostoevsky and Brothers Karamazov, and where he talks about a single tear of a child and how that is important in the scheme of things. And so I wonder if maybe when Dostoevsky was writing this, maybe he was referring to the scene where a single intentionality of a person becomes this redeeming quality that actually makes all the difference in the world. Now, again, this is to an artist's mind, but that's the something that I wanted to point out, because it is both beautiful and intriguing that Dante chooses to place such an importance on this last, essentially the dying breath, repentant breath of a person, and also there's an interesting rabbit hole there where, of course, the devil says, well, I can't have the soul of Buonconte, but I will try to deal with his body. And so it seems that the devil is orchestrating all these natural occurrences to make sure that the body gets washed away into this river and then gets buried. Almost made me think of Mephistopheles in Faustus, how the devil says, I am part of this power which always works for evil and always affects the good. And it always seems like this very Faustian type of tribute to the works of the evil one on earth. And this idea that the devil can influence different weather phenomena and so forth. Anyway, just so many different interesting things that come out as you read this. I want to point out at least a couple of them.
Wonderful, wonderful. It's going to be Maxine, and looks like Doug is back. So if Doug, you want to talk, just go ahead and type exclamation mark or raise your hand or something. But first up is going to be Maxine. Maxine, go ahead.
It makes me think, how high would he have to go to get to paradise? How will he know when he's there? And if so, how does he take care of the question of sliding backward down to purgatory again? Or he hasn't addressed that problem.
Okay. Does anybody want to answer that?
I'll just venture a guess.
Go ahead.
That when he gets to paradise, he has reached what Henry Corbin and the Sufi mystics call the eighth climb, which is at one with everything. The thing that's there before the creation, it's everything, and there's no way to describe anything. It's just, you know, all things at one with the creator.
Thank you, Franklin. Next up is David. David, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm going to just take a question out of the chat because it wasn't asked out loud. And if you want to let people take a shot at it, it says, can poetry lead to truth and salvation? In other words, what Dante is doing here, right?
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Does anybody want to address that?
Okay, I want to actually address that.
Go ahead.
David, it's a tragic question for Virgil, because Virgil actually composed this eclogue in which he mentions a virgin bearing a child. And yet, according to Virgil himself, because he was so Platonic and so rationalistic and so not prepared to humble himself, he never made that connection, and therefore he is doomed forever. And yet his poetry came so close to saving him, and yet no cigar. In Paradiso, we will meet another person who actually achieves this through the poetry, and that's Statius, I think. I think he is the one that actually makes that leap of faith through something that is similar. So it seems to me that Dante's opinion is that, yes, art has some salvific qualities.
Right, but it sort of is leading you, but you have to make this leap.
Right.
Right.
Wonderful. Next up is Doug. Doug, go ahead.
Yeah, on that point, I actually looked up the Dante references in Karen Armstrong's book on the history of God, and it turns out that he was influenced by Ibn al-Arabi, whose concept of the imagination was very similar to Dante's. I think it's also very similar to Charles Dickens many centuries later, the power of the imagination. And so one of the questions that I noticed in the chat, can poetry lead to salvation? Or one of the great translators of German literature and a philosopher, Walter Kaufmann, who wrote a number of books and translated vast amounts of Nietzsche, actually in one of his books on a critique on philosophy and religion, he really says the great religions are based on poetry. The poetry of the Jewish prophets, the poetry of the Mahayana Zen Buddhists, the poetry, you can see it around the world, that religion is not far away from poetry. He actually believes when you start to interpret the poetry literally is when religion gets in trouble. That poetry is a system of energy access, images and words, and there's sort of a structure there. So I think Dante is very much working in that tradition. I was glad to hear somebody else mention the Sufi tradition. She also talks about the ascent of Muhammad being some influence on Dante, and there's some reason to believe there was, and I think maybe Phil or other people have mentioned that. And this relates to this. I feel like some of what I've said to CJ has been filtered, not consciously, but I've been trying to make a distinction between the trope of ineffability, which is a literary device, which is, oh, I can't do this, I can't do this. And then he points at the outside field fence, and like Babe Ruth hits a home run and he does exactly what he says he can't do. That's a literary trope, you know, pleading impotence and then knocking it out of the ballpark. And I think Dante does that all the time. But then there is ineffability, the experience that cannot be put into words, which is any experience of extreme pain and extreme joy, which is very rare. Most of the time we filter that out. But when people experience that, they have a very hard time putting it into words. And other people start calling it a psychotic reaction, which it might be. You know, I mean, there's poetry and then there's psychoses, and the line between them is pretty hard. So that's all I would like to add. I did want to touch
Thank
that
you.
thing about what is ineffable and what's the imitation of ineffability, which is a poet's game.
Wonderful. So we did an entire meetup around this topic just 2-3 hours ago. The form in which this question was posed is, what is the relationship between mythos and logos? Like, for example, Plato banished poets from his Republic because they were Homeric poets, which are using the oral performance of a myth, a story, actually channeling characters and making them real to people as a way of communicating ideas. And he says, no, 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 it is the logos, explicitly thinking out things with clarity, written down, is what you need. Therefore, there is a logos versus mythos. Now, that is not true in the Bible, for example. That is especially, let's say, take the Hebrew tradition, where even logos is spoken word. So there is the speech that comes through. There is the literal and there is the allegorical meaning of things. Parables, stories incessantly are used in order to elaborate what the logos is saying. So there is this marriage between logos and mythos. Mythos ability, because what you're trying to do, it's we looked at it from multiple angles. You can think of it as figure and ground. What explicit words are very good at doing is to point exactly at things. There is a tremendous power to that. But as Walter Ong, we were focusing on his work, he says all text is pretext. Okay, now I would add to that, all text is pretext because it is lacking the entire context. Okay, so whatever you're reading, right, there is actually so much behind it, which gives its meaning. And that is what art does. The metaphors are very powerful because they are alluding to, they are suggesting to a lot more rich meaning. That is actually what is tried to be captured in the explicit words. We're doing this entire series on Dao De Jing, where we take this one poem, and these poems are in Chinese characters, which are visual characters, very few characters. Each of them, this is ancient Chinese. Each of those characters are actually connected to percepts and are suggesting many things. And we are doing this using multiple translations. We are trying to interpret what it means, but the richness of the meaning. The first poem there starts with what is unnamed and what is named. He says the core of nature, core of existence, the Tao, is unnamed. It is what it is. Names are the father of 10,000 things. So names are important, but they are manifestations of the eternal. So there is the ineffable and there is the effable, and there is a relationship between them. And all of that is actually captured in these traditions. So that's, that's what we've been talking about in this series on Walter Ong and language. Another way of looking at it is orality and literacy. Look at what we are doing here. We are using words which are digitized, very specific words, and then we are having conversations about them. If you look at the medieval tradition, this was actually common to it. The books actually captured. Look at that. This is again a separate point I wanted to make, but I want to connect it to this. Look at what Dante is doing. It's all of knowledge, everything that he knows about everything. Okay, whatever he knows of science, whatever he knows about politics, whatever he knows about religion, whatever he knows about morality, whatever he knows about human nature, all of it is packed in to this one thing. And this book is precious. And then you spend a lot of time interpreting it, talking about it. That's how, typically this was done for the Bible. But that is the standard of the kind of the scribal age. Now, what happens in the print age is that books become dime a dozen. And the way we approach them is not like this. So what we are doing right now is actually very similar to how the scribes did this. Books were very precious. You actually had to write it down. Books was very hard to come by. And you would write about it and you would talk about it to a group of people who are deeply interested and are studying the same things. So what we are doing here is, folks, I think it's in the medieval tradition, the scribal tradition of looking at things in that. And the fact that we are talking about it, all of us are talking about it, is what is necessary to interpret these deep things. So that's what I wanted to say. So any thoughts, any comments on that? Anybody? Madeline.
Yes, I actually was following you, Shrikant. I'd like to just retrace my steps and traverse backwards a bit to what Doug had been saying about the ineffable. And I was very interested in what I caught of what he said of that, that art can, I think it was, art can either imitate the ineffable or it can bring us to the ineffable. Did I have that right, Doug? And can you expand upon it, whether I'm right or wrong? I mean, whether or not I have it right, can you expand upon your thought? And you're on mute. No, you're sideways and on mute. Still on mute.
I know.
Go ahead.
I was sending a text actually addressing some of this. I think art, actually, music, drama, the arts that deal with time, music, dance, drama, poetry, I think they frame the silence and point to the ineffable. It's like in Zen, the Zen koan about or the Zen pot about the finger pointing at the moon. Everybody focuses on the finger, the thing that's pointing, but in fact, the artwork points at something that's bigger than the finger. It's pointing, the poetry and art are pointing at the moon being a symbol of something ineffable and hard to grasp and cannot be reduced. And I think what Shrikant was saying, in Jewish tradition, God is the name who can't be named. In Allah, in Islamic traditions, actually means the nothingness. So anytime you try to define God, and this comes out in the English mystical text, The Cloud of Unknowing, that if anything appears and seems to be God, you push it away, because if you can actually see it and describe it, it's not God. It's something else. That's an old English mystical text, The Cloud of Unknowing. So I think these ideas are swirling around. And I think that's what Walter Kaufman was getting at. There's the early Hebrew gods and wars, and then with the Jewish prophets and the Greek philosophers and the Buddha, they all appear somewhat at the same time in history around the world, and they have a whole different approach to religion that's based on the imagination and on poetry and sometimes on music and sometimes on visual art, maybe, but many of the traditions you don't create an image to get to this, because that's, and I like Shrikant's reference to the name that can be named. It's not the real name. The name divides. The reality cannot be divided. And I think Bucky works in that world too, between the entropy where everything falls apart. But for Bucky, life is what synthesized and brought everything together in a synergetic unity. So that division, life unifies, but physical matter falls apart. So you get these sort of, and in the falling apart, you get names. You can name things when they have categories.
Wonderful.
So this urge to categorize everything right now, I think is dangerous because it sometimes takes us away from just what's actually happening.
Wonderful. Phil.
Same as then.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I was trying to remember the term, but it escapes me at the moment. But anyway, in the Russian Orthodox tradition, the Christian tradition, there's a similar concept, I think, which is you try to describe the divine, not by saying what it is, but by saying what it isn't. It's the negative. And there's a term, like I said, maybe somebody remembers here, it'd be great, but that's the point. And it's this idea that you can't ever really express what God is, but you can express what he's not. So he is not bounded, he is not in one place, etc., and not, aging, etc., not changeable. But you can't really say what he is. You just try to take everything away, and whatever is left, there's still a lot of room there. So that's the point I was trying to make.
Yeah, and I would recommend the first verse or first chapter. It's a very short poem of Dao De Jing, which actually makes this point explicitly and beautifully in a completely different context, but it's the same point. All right, folks. So thank you very much. Phil, what is coming up next?
I believe we are cantos 12 through 22 for next time. And then the next session after that will be the remaining cantos of Purgatory. But for this time, it's going to be 12 through 22.
All right, wonderful. All right, folks, thank you so much. Great discussion. See you folks soon.
Scott.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, David.